Readers, we've been doing a great job mining for details, finding out little things about characters that are interesting. Everything they do, we notice. Everything they say, we can think about. And it helps us to understand the characters, helps us to identify with them. Maybe we would have acted the same way. Maybe we wouldn't have. But sometimes characters do things that don't quite make sense. Sometimes we'll read something that a character did or said, and we'll think, that didn't sound like her at all. That was odd. There are times when the people that we read about act out of character, meaning they do something that's not like what they normally would have done. And when we notice characters that act out of place like that, we think, what is making them do that? We always think, I wonder why that character is acting differently. For example, in the last chapter, 27, Sistine actually put a hand on Robb's arm and said, "Shh, he's leaving, Tiger. Watch." To me, Sistine was acting out of character a little bit. I would not have expected her to touch Robb on the arm and try and calm him down and make him feel comfortable again. After all, Sistine is a very bold, aggressive, intense character, usually. And I wonder why she did that to Robb. Maybe it was because she really cares about Robb and the tiger, and she wanted Robb to see and witness what was about to happen. And she wanted maybe Robb to feel comfortable again, because she noticed he was howling and yelling and shaking the cage. He was a little bit out of control. In chapter 28, let's find some parts, at least one, where a character is acting differently than they normally would, and we'll think about it. Chapter 28. "Oh," said Sistine in that voice that Robb loved. "See," she said, "that was the right thing. That was the right thing to do." Robb nodded, but in his mind, he saw a flash of green. He remembered what happened to Cricket. "What?" Sistine said, turning to him. "What are you thinking about?" Robb shook his head. "Nothing," he told her. "Robert!" The sound of his name came floating to them from the direction of the motel. "That's my dad," he said, confused. "That's my dad calling me." And then they heard Willie Mae. "Dear Jesus!" she screamed, her voice high and wild, and then there was the crack of a gun. They both stood still, stunned and silent, and when Willie Mae came running out from under the pine trees and saw them, she stopped. "Thank you, Jesus," she said, looking up at the sky. "2 whole children. Thank you. Come here," she said. She opened her arms. "Come to me." Robb started walking toward her. He wanted to tell her that she was wrong. He wanted to tell her that he did not feel whole, but he did not have the energy or the heart to say anything. All he could manage was putting one foot in front of the other. All he could do was keep walking toward Willie Mae. Willie Mae led them back, and when Robb saw the tiger on the ground and his father standing over it, holding the rifle, he felt something rise up in him, an anger as big and powerful as the tiger. Bigger. "You killed him," he said to his father. "I had to," the father said. "That was my tiger," Robb screamed. "You killed him. You killed my tiger." He ran at his father and attacked him. He beat him with his fists. He kicked him, but his father stood like a wall. He held the gun up over his head and kept his eyes open and took each hit without blinking. And Robb saw that hitting wasn't going to be enough, so he did something he thought he would never do. He opened his suitcase, and the words sprang out of it, coiled and explosive. I wish it had been you, he screamed. I wish it had been you that died. I hate you. You ain't the one I need. I need her. I need her. The world and everything in it seemed to stop moving. He stared at his father. His father stared at him. Say her name, Rob screamed into the silence. You say it. Caroline, his father whispered, with the gun still over his head, with his eyes still open. And with that word, with the small sound of his mother's name, the world lurched back into motion. Like an old merry-go-round, it started to spin again. His father put the gun down and pulled Rob to him. Caroline, his father whispered. Caroline, Caroline, Caroline. Rob buried his face into his father's shirt. It smelled like sweat and turpentine and green leaves. I need her, Rob said. I need her too, said his father, pulling Rob closer. But we don't got her, neither one of us. What we got, all we got, is each other. And we got to learn to make do with that. I ain't going to cry, Rob said, shutting his eyes. But the tears leaked out of him anyway. Then they came in a rush, and he couldn't stop. He cried from somewhere deep inside of himself, from the place where his mother had been, the same place that the tiger had been and was gone from now. Rob looked up and saw his father wiping tears from his own eyes. All right, said his father, holding Rob tight. That's all right, he said. You're okay. When Rob finally looked up again, he saw Willie Mae holding Sistine like she was a baby, rocking her and saying, shh. Willie Mae stared back at him. Don't think you're going to start pounding on me now, she said. No, ma'am, said Rob. He wiped the back of his hand across his nose and slid out of his father's arms. I went and got your daddy, Willie Mae told Rob as she swayed back and forth, rocking Sistine. I figured out what you was going to do, and then I ain't no telling, and there ain't no telling what that tiger would have done once he got out of that cage. I went and got your daddy, and he could save you. Yes, ma'am, said Rob. He went and stood over the open-eyed tiger. The bullet hole in his head was red and small. Didn't look big enough to kill him. Go ahead and touch him, said Sistine. Rob looked up. She was standing beside him. Her dress was twisted and wrinkled. Her eyes were red. Rob stared at her and she nodded. So he knelt and put out a hand and placed it on the tiger's head. He felt the tears rise up in him again. Sistine crouched down next to him. She put her hand on the tiger, too. He was so pretty, she said. He was one of the prettiest things I have ever seen. Rob nodded. We have to have a funeral for him, Sistine said. He's a fallen warrior. We have to bury him right. Rob sat down next to the tiger and ran his hand over the rough fur again and again, while the tears traveled down his cheeks and dropped onto the ground. Well, I don't know about you, but I almost cried when I was reading that chapter, especially at the end, when Sistine told Rob to go ahead and touch the tiger, who was already dead, but his eyes were open still. You know, that happens to bodies sometimes. Sometimes when a body dies, like an animal or a person, their eyes stay open. And then somebody can go and close them. Anyway, when I was reading that and I was picturing Rob kneeling down on the ground and running his hands through the soft, thick fur, and I was thinking about how Rob had felt about his mother and what he had just said to his father, I almost cried. We have to read books like this. We have to feel the things that the author wants us to feel. It helps us to enjoy the book. It helps us to feel like we're learning about what's really happening in the book. Now, there were a couple of instances where I thought Rob acted out of character, and one of them was when he started beating on his dad. He's never done that before. He's always just said to his dad things like, "Yes, sir," or he's just been silent with his dad. But in this chapter, we learned that his true feelings came out. Everything that he had packed up tight in that suitcase. Well, he let that all open up, didn't he? I wonder why he acted out of character. Why do you think Rob yelled at his dad and beat on him and said things like, "I wish it was you who died, not her. I need her"? Why did Rob say those things? That's your job. At least 3 sentences explaining why Rob acted out of character at this chapter.